I'm Kate, and this is going to be a little quick video about my favorite books of 2025. I'm going to make it snappy, I'm going to make it fast, I'm going to try at least, because I know you've been watching like 1,000 of these this month. I know I have, and I have lots of ideas of what I want to read this year, so hopefully you can gather a few from this video. I'm going to quickly start with some honorable mentions, because sometimes you like a book and hate a book at the same time, but because of its content, it's kind of hard to give it your full endorsement. So I'm going to quickly talk about those. I think by talking about them, you'll sort of understand why they're honorable mentions. So the first one is going to be Lolita. One of my favorite books of last year was My Dark Vanessa, which was about a situation between a teacher and a student, and it was a really compelling, moving book. And they reference Lolita a lot in that, and Lolita is considered an American classic, and it's a gap in my knowledge. And I was never moved to read it because I had seen the Kubrick film and the way that pop culture has talked about Lolita, and then I was always creeped out by that. But reading the novel, it's actually like it's a horror story from the perspective of the bad guy in a way that is really unsettling and creepy, but also at the same time compelling, and that the author is talking about the ways we don't protect our children, and that it's a fierce criticism of the 1950s America. And for that reason, it was like a really fascinating read. And the prose is also brilliant. Nabokov is such a great writer. I definitely want to read more from him. However, I was sick to my stomach a lot while reading this book. It was really intense about the things that they talked about. I'm not explaining Lolita to you or the plot because you know, and also it's the first 2 minutes of the video, and if I start using certain words, YouTube is going to shadow ban this, and there's no way that anyone will see this if I use any harsh language right off the bat. But you know what Lolita's about, but actually you kind of don't know what Lolita's about unless you've read it, because then you sort of get what the author was going for in the first place and what he was speaking out against. And then unfortunately his work is co-opted by popular media and then defanged and considered a certain way. Like now you have 14-year-old girls playing Lolita in movies with heart-shaped sunglasses and bikini scenes, and the sort of sexualization of children because of this story. So like its social context is unsettling. However, I think actually reading the book makes it easier to sort of contextualize things, and it put me at ease, at least, about that this writer wasn't actually endorsing that four-syllable word. So it's hard for me to recommend Lolita like wholeheartedly, because it did make me feel really ill because of the actions described and the relationship depicted. However, it was really valuable to me in order to read this and make it part of the American canon. The prose was really beautiful. I feel like I was able to understand this pop culture phenomenon better by reading it. So if that sounds interesting to you, it is worthwhile, and it was one of the most impactful reading experiences I've had this year. It's just that I can't be going around telling people to read Lolita without people giving me a weird look, which fair enough. The other honorable mention I want to talk about is Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. I talked about this a couple months ago. This is she's a photographer. This is about a photographer, and her life's kind of falling apart, and most of it's her fault, some of it's not. And she takes, is it long enough in the video yet for me to use this word? I'm gonna use it. She's a fetish photographer, and so a lot of her subject matter is demeaning to men, and so the book talks a lot about her relationship with men and her relationship with the world, the relationship with herself, and the tone of the book is really conversational. I mean, it was really addictive to read. I just couldn't stop reading it. It was like she was talking directly to me with this sort of like casual speech. I found her both appalling and really intriguing. In my last video, I talked about Luster and how emotionally cathartic it can be to read about a main character who's kind of crazy, a female character who's kind of crazy and who does things that she would never do, but there's something cathartic about that kind of brutality and violence by a woman, if that makes any sense. And that's why I'm not like fully endorsing it, because it is kind of a violent book, and that there is some gore aspects to it, and she is a really, really unlikable character, but that she's still compelling. So that's kind of a weird thing to balance, but I still really enjoyed this book. It was really impactful to me. I am recommending it to people, but only certain kinds of people. Like if I know them, I'm like, I can trust that when you read this book, you know what I mean when I say that it's great. So that's why it's an honorable mention and doesn't make it like into my top 10. So those are two books that I would recommend conditionally, I guess. So now let's talk about number 10, which is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. I'm a big fan of John Green. I mean, he basically wrote my adolescence. I'm a big fan of his internet presence, and he's also a trustee for, what is it, Partners in Health, I think. And when he was in Sierra Leone, because he fights for, or he helps advocate for the like maternity wards and stuff. And while he was over there, he met this boy who had tuberculosis named Henry, and Henry had a significant impact on him because he didn't realize how significant tuberculosis was. For example, tuberculosis killed more people in 2023 than like cancer and war and famine combined, and that it has always had a significant presence in our society, but nobody really talks about illness. We're always talking about love, and we're always talking about war, but no one's ever talking about illness, which is another human inevitability and a fact of life, but no one's ever writing about it. But John is, and that this is like an extension of his advocacy, and sort of the culmination of his all those years of research and passion, and his friendship with Henry is a big part of the book. However, there's also a lot of history of the illness, which can be both bleak, because he talks about like the racialization of medicine and who has access to drugs and where and why. But then there's also these kind of fun facts, like how tuberculosis has affected urbanization, or the cowboy hat, or, you know, World War I, etc. So it is both sort of fun and engaging in terms of fun facts. You feel like you're learning a lot, and then there's also this really like emotional, heartfelt aspect with Henry. And is it his name Henry? His name is Henry, sorry. So the whole thing is just, I mean, it's the easiest book to recommend in the world, really, because there's something in there for everyone, and you feel like a better global citizen after having read it. Number 9 is The Color of Water by James McBride. This is a memoir. The subtitle is A Black Man's Tribute to His White Mother, and his background is that his mother is white and his father was black, and when his mother married his father, her family held a funeral for her. They sat Shiva because she was like dead to them, and she would subsequently have 12 children, and she was raising 12 black children in Harlem, I think, all by herself. And it's kind of a funny image of old white lady surrounded by 12 black children. That is funny to me, but also really endearing. And the book itself is a combination of both the author's upbringing with his mother and the kind of character that she was, and the sort of values she instilled in him, and that kind of weird relationship that he had with his own background, because she was so mysterious about hers. She would never really own up to her past, her race, her previous religion, or anything, where she was. And that's where the other side of the book comes in, where he's interviewing her about her past in rural Virginia as one of the only Jewish people in the community. Her father was a rabbi and a grocer, and so it talks a lot about sort of racial relations, and it talks a lot about family. Anne Patchett called this the universal donor, because there's kind of something in this book for everybody. It talks about motherhood, and even like good motherhood or bad motherhood. If you have a really tight family or a weird family dynamic, it talks about class and gender and poverty. So there really is, it's just chock full of stuff that is really compelling and really interesting. And this is another one of those books that's so easy to recommend, because not only is it so good and so well written, but it is kind of for everyone, that everybody could find something out of this. And I know I certainly did, because I love my mommy, and any book about mothers does make me tear up a little, and I did cry a little at this one, and it's not the only book I cried at on this list. And also that my parents are two different races, so I can kind of understand where he was coming from and sort of the building of your own identity and how it can be tricky sometimes when you have come from uncertain, ambiguous sort of backgrounds. So that's why I connected to it, but again, anyone could connect to it, so I definitely recommend this to everyone. Number 8 is going to be Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I have been talking about this since I read it in, I guess, January or February. I just am recommending this all the time, and this is the first book I read by R.F. Kuang, and I have subsequently read everything she's ever written. This was my R.F. Kuang year, and this book is a literary thriller, and let me tell you, it's really thrilling. It's about this girl, and she's an author, and she has this acquaintance who's way more successful than she is. She got really successful young, and our protagonist is white, and her acquaintance is Asian, and they're hanging out one day, and her acquaintance chokes on, I think it's an Eggo waffle, and dies. And she has her unfinished manuscript in the other room that nobody knows about. So then our protagonist is like, well, I'll just take that and edit it and maybe call it mine. But it does snowball to that decision. Sometimes like, oh, I'll just look at it, and then maybe I'm editing it, and then maybe it's mine, and then maybe I've edited enough so that it has become mine. And there's this really kind of like 4D chess that the protagonist is playing. Like, she's crazy, and you know she's crazy, and you're not on her side. It's just sometimes her reasoning, she's connecting dots that I'm like, hey, wait a second. And then I hate myself for like agreeing with her psycho shenanigans. And I love the observations the book makes about like who can write what. I mean, we've had these conversations a lot in the past 10-15 years in the publishing industry. Like, can non-Asian people write stories about Asian people? And then fill in the blanks. I mean, can anybody write anything about anyone if it's not like personally their community? And there's a lot of variety of answers to this. And so this talked about it in a way that I found really interesting. It's a little lower on the list because the ending was a little bit too thriller cliche, but not in a way that I felt spoiled the rest of the book, because it wasn't really so much like the thrillery aspects that was keeping me hooked. It was the interesting perspective of the protagonist, as well as the conversations that R.F. Kuang was having with the narrative about all the themes. So that's why I recommend it. It's also an easy book to recommend because it's just kind of fun. It's just kind of a fun one. Number 7 is Men We Reaped by Jesmyn Ward. We're going from a really fun title to a really emotionally raw title. This one is about, it's another memoir. It's an author, and she's writing about the 5 Black men in her life that all died in this period of 4 years, and the last of whom, or the first of whom, was her brother. And it was like a really intense period of her life, and so she, with this book, is grieving them and remembering them, and also putting their deaths into a greater context as to understand the things that Black men are more vulnerable to in our society. For example, gang violence, mental health issues, drug abuse issues. And so in that sense, you had this amazing narrative that she was able to weave, because she's mostly a novelist, and I'm going to read her novels after this. I'm really interested in the way she writes, because she was talking about, you know, the history of her childhood, her life, in regular chronological order, and then she was talking about the deaths of the men in her life in reverse chronological order, because she could talk about her brother last, because she had to work herself up to it. So therefore the two timelines meet in the middle, and that was a really compelling aspect to the book. So it has this narrative to it, like she is just a really good storyteller while also feeling informative and topical and important. And it was so moving because I have a brother, and the ending of it and her talking about her brother, I'm getting kind of choked up now talking about it, because I have a brother and I love him, and the idea of something bad happening to him is very unsettling, and I can understand her close relationship with her brother, and it just felt really close to home. and I cried so hard I needed to be held. So if you feel like you can handle such a thing, then read this. I still feel it's important to read. I wish this was a kind of book assigned to schools. This would feel like an important piece to add to the curriculum, but it is intense, and I do spend a lot of time recommending it, a little with a bit of hesitation, just because of how emotionally powerful it was, or at least the extreme effect that it had on me. Next, I want to talk about another memoir. This is number 6. This is How to Say Babylon by Sylvia Sinclair. This one, she's a poet and she's from Jamaica, and she was raised in Rastafarian. She was raised with a Rastafarian practice or Rastafarian religion, and because of its patriarchal hierarchies and its kind of almost oppressive, misogynistic nature, it was really isolating to her because her father was sort of this end-all be-all authority. She wasn't allowed to cut her hair or brush her hair or wear pants. She was prevented from going to school a lot, and there was this really isolating childhood experience. However, she was able to free herself from the physical location of this religious upbringing, but also free herself to a new way of thinking through education and through the pursuit, is that a word? Of her art, specifically poetry. So in that sense, it's a really good comp title to Educated by Tara Westover. In that book, which was one of my favorites of last year actually, she was in an extreme Christian isolationist household out in Idaho, I think, and she was not allowed to go to school at all, and she was eventually able to like self-educate, and she ended up going to like both Cambridge and Oxford or something crazy. So this has a similar feel of self-assurance and resilience. Therefore, because it felt really resilient, it had an uplifting kind of feeling to it, although it talked a lot about really hard topics and a lot of her difficult to deal with memories and difficult to read about memories. Because she was overcoming something, it did feel uplifting, and at the end of the book there was a lot about building bridges and forgiveness, that I can imagine that if you come from a tough background or you have a difficult relationship with your family, reading this would be kind of healing and uplifting for you as well. And then this is one of the books I read this year that is so well written, it's almost frustrating. It almost pisses me off, like, why can't I write like that? She's a poet, so it's like a really poetic, lyrical prose style that is really compelling and so beautiful. I think I listened to it on audio a bit and then read it digitally, but I wish I had a physical copy so I could just highlight it all over, because it's just so well written. So even if the subject doesn't appeal to you at all, the style of how it was written is gorgeous. I mean, think like Betty by Tiffany McDaniel, think On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, like highly poetic, compelling writing. As we get further up the list, we're now in my top 5. I'm finding it really difficult to find an order for these. So the next 5 it's going to be a little loosey-goosey. I'm just going to pick at random, and I think I know the order, but I've been thinking about it for like weeks now, and I'm still struggling to figure out my 5. So I'm going to say, because I read it the most recently, that Deep Cuts by Holly Brickley will be my number 5. I only read it like 2 months ago, but it really made a big impact. I really loved it. I had such a great time. This is about 2 people. One is like sort of an indie rock star, and the other one is kind of a music critic, and they meet in college, and it's the story of their life over maybe 8 years. And I think there's a line in the book that I felt really summarized the story, which is how many ways can the same 2 people break each other's hearts? And so it's like their love story and their friendship, and it talked a lot about music. It was also a real testament to the 2000s, which is a decade not a lot of people are writing about, but it is an interesting era. I also felt that this one was really well written, both from the storytelling narrative aspect, but also the book is kind of has a bunch of her music essays written in it, and it did feel like Holly Brickley just wanted to talk about certain songs, and so she was writing essays about them and adding them in, and I didn't care because I loved them. I love reading about music, I love writing about music, and so this was just like a really fun one. And I think this is the kind of like romantic story I like reading, about two flawed young people who kind of keep fucking up over and over again, and you want them together and you don't want them together. I love that. I love that so much. And this was a debut, and I'm so excited to see whatever she publishes next. For the longest time, I've had this book as my #1 book of the year. It's the first book I read this year, but as I've been considering it over the course of this day, I'm gonna put it at #4 actually, and that's gonna be Penance by Eliza Clark. This is the other Eliza Clark. She also wrote Boy Parts, and she's got a short story collection I'd like to read this year. But Penance is so good. It's crazy good. It's like metafiction true crime, and because I fall in and out of true crime, like I'm morbidly curious, but I think the genre is bad for victims and it's kind of unethical and exploitative, and so this book talks a little bit about that. And one of my favorite books of last year was Bright Young Women, and so this was constantly sort of in the same conversation with that book, and so I wanted to give this one a try. And this one is about, it's a group of young people on some small coastal town in England, and they're a bunch of teenage girls, and they go out one night and set their friend on fire, and after she dies, it's like an entire, it's a national news story, but then it kind of dies out after a while. People stop talking about it, and then someone brings it up in a podcast like many years later, and it becomes this whole like true crime hyperfixation online. And this is all the setup. I'm not really spoiling anything. So then this guy, this fictional character, starts writing the true crime book that you're reading. So it's kind of like book within a book, or like book sort of pretending to be a different book, if that makes sense. So the book is kind of phrased like a true crime book, or it's like formed like a true crime book with like interviews of the parents and like assessment of the situation, and history of the town, and talking about the social hierarchies between the girls and how something like this could have happened and what happened afterwards. And so it's like really fascinating, and I think that Eliza Clark has the understanding of this generation, of our generation, the same way that Hemingway understood his. Like, she just has her finger on the pulse of what it is to be in like 21st century digital girlhood, and that the things that they talked about, like Tumblr and The Sims and Taylor Swift discourse in 2014, all of that just was so delicious to me and so interesting. And I love these like the intense social hierarchies of teenage girls and how like psychotic that can be. I mean, half the population has lived through it. It's insane what teenage girls do to each other, and how you fall in and out of favor with friends. The only reason it's not at #1 is it has kind of a polarizing ending that I can't reveal here without making the whole reading superfluous. I don't want to spoil anything. But as I'm thinking about the ending more and more, I was like kind of into it in the beginning, and now I'm like reconsidering if I liked sort of the conclusion the book came to. And because the ending's so polarizing, it does make it slightly hard to recommend. And I read it so long ago. I mean, I still think about it all the time, but I'm just gonna put a few more books ahead of it. But I still really, really like it. I'm still feral for it. I'm frothing at the mouth. I will beg anyone to read it. It's just so good. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a large part of my reading year, which was the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. I had a few slots lower, but I honestly couldn't do that to myself, because it was just such a big part of my reading year. I read it over the course of maybe 6 months or something, and they're long books, and I was really invested in it. And I don't know, it just, when I think back on last year, I think about these books, which is why they have to have just such a high spot in the list. And I am cheating here by having all 3 books in one slot, but it's my video and I make the rules. And this fantasy trilogy, it just brought back a kind of nostalgia, like the good parts of adolescence, where you're reading, I don't know, the Hunger Games trilogy in your room and you want to know what happens and all of your favorite characters. And so it just had this energy, this pixie dust over it that I just found so enjoyable. So the first one is about a young girl named Rin, and she escapes an arranged marriage by studying for and then eventually getting into a very elite military school in this sort of like fictionalized version of China. And the school is really intense, and there's a lot of discussion about the color of her skin and her spot as a woman and all of these, and she's trying to learn this nearly extinct shamanism where it like gives her power of fire, and it's about her ki, and it's kind of in that sense maybe a little Naruto or Avatar kind of. I can see how she could be fans of either one of those. And then so it's kind of a big school setting for the first third of that, and then it breaks out into war, and the whole book is kind of an extended allegory of China's relationship with Japan, and it has like really intense, brutal war scenes, think like Rape of Nanking, and so it's really intense, but I really enjoyed the characters, specifically Rin. I love a crazy female main character. This is something we know. The second book is more like about, I'm trying not to spoil too much because it is a series. The second book is more about China's relationship with the West and China's relationship with itself, if that makes sense. And this gets a bit more into religion, it gets more into like globalization maybe. It's my favorite of it. I just love the way she was able to zoom out and talks about different aspects of this fantasy society. I love that. And then the third one is just balls to the wall, is bonkers bananas. The main character is absolutely at her peak insane, and there is something cathartic about that, but also something slightly irritating. So the series, I mean, the whole thing is what, like 3,000 pages or something crazy, so it has its highs and its lows, but I still loved it. It was still wonderful. I had such a great time, and I really treasure that reading experience, and I definitely recommend it if you're trying to get back into fantasy or you aren't into fantasy. This could be an interesting place to start because it's so accessible, and I like the way it weaves sort of the fantastical elements with historical allegory. Okay, number 2 is going to be another memoir. I love a memoir. This one is called In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. And this is another one that's so well written it pisses me off. And it's a memoir about the author's experience with same-sex domestic abuse. It's about her complicated abusive relationship with her former partner, and the chapters are really interesting small vignettes that take forms of different literary genres or stereotypes or cliches. Like the dream house is erotica, the dream house is paranormal, the dream house is choose your own adventure, and in that chapter you're her, and you're going through the day and seeing that no matter what you do you can't win with an abusive partner. It's like really interesting, high concept way of communicating the ideas that were really fascinating, and the way, like the creative experimental ways that she was talking about things. It's like great for people who love a memoir, it's great for people who love writing, and it's great for people who want to read something that they've like really never read before. Like there's nothing like this. It is really interesting, and just the way she was able to do it is crazy. And additionally, I felt like I learned a lot because there were sort of passages of history of same-sex domestic violence, specifically between two women, and the way it feels like a stereotype for lesbians to hit each other, and therefore when you're a lesbian or you're in a relationship with a woman and you're in that situation, it's kind of hard to speak out because then you're giving homophobes proof that your relationship isn't perfect or legitimate, and that there's this whole PR crisis with same-sex relationships where you have to be perfect, but you also have to prove that you're just like everybody else and you can never win. And so it did feel topical and important, and also like kind of weirdly fun because of the way she was writing it and the experimental nature of it. I have tried to explain this book like 10 times and I can never get it right. it really is just something you have to read to believe. It is just, it's banana, it's so good. And then my number one book of last year, because who am I kidding? It has to be this one, is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. Nothing last year made me feel the way this book made me feel. And for that reason, it just has to be number one. This is a post-climate crisis dystopian set in America around 2024 to 2027, but it was published in the 90s. And the way she was talking about the US and its insane politics and hunger insecurity, food insecurity, and violence just felt really prophetic. The character herself is probably the reason I like the book so much. I've just never connected to a main character this way before, and it feels like if I gave this book to somebody, I would, it's just like, this is the key to me. You will understand me if you've read this. She is she has this thing called hyper empathy, and because her mother abused a certain drug when she was in the womb, and now she has this hyper empathetic condition where she feels what everyone else is feeling, even physically. Like if someone's bleeding in front of her, she will bleed and be in pain. And it's this part of her character that I found really compelling, because one, I have a chronic condition, and it's kind of exhausting to, like, every time you meet somebody new, tell them about it, and like do it in a way that where you're not trying to get sympathy or just kind of advocating for your own needs and for what's best for the group. And two, who can you trust with this information? So there's a lot of that was really similar to me in an odd way. And then she was creating, like, on the fly, this religion, not really creating it. I think she was just observing the world around her and documenting her philosophies as she sees. And there were so many aspects of this religion that she was crafting that I really connected to, because I'm sort of on my own journey of like crafting what works for me spiritually, and a lot of what she was saying was making a lot of sense. And I feel that just the power of the novel is in the perspective of the main character, and that's what sets it apart from everything else. And because you could read other dystopians, but this teenage girl, this young woman that she eventually becomes, is just different from everybody else. She's just like unparalleled in terms of how I related to her and how she's written, and I just found it like a really powerful book in a way that it's almost difficult to talk about, because it does feel so personal and it does feel almost too simple. Where I'm like, it's a dystopian book about a girl and things happen, and it's just hard to communicate how much it meant to me and this like intangible emotion it drew out of me, and how I felt really seeing myself on the pages is just kind of indescribable. And I think when you are left with no words, you have no choice but to put it at number one. I read it from the library, and then I immediately went and bought it physically so that I could highlight it. This is my new sacred text, and that it has a sequel that I'm going to be reading as soon as possible. So call it Old Testament, New Testament, because this is my new sacred text. I really, really loved this, and it's one of those books where you love it so much you're almost afraid to recommend it to people, because it does feel so personable and so vulnerable, looking into my soul by reading this. So anyway, I feel like I've gone too far. That's how I feel, and that was my number one. So those were my favorite books of last year. I'm really excited for this year of reading. I feel like the more and more I go on, I feel the more in tune with my taste, the more I'm learning about myself as I'm reading, and I'm having a great time. So let me know in the comments what your favorite books of the year were, which of these books that you're gonna pick up, because I apparently explained them so well, and like and subscribe or whatever, and bye. Okay, bye.